Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to a very special VMware webinar. Understand your cloud costs and save money with VMware Aria Operations. I'm AJ, but I'd like to introduce our two hosts for today. We have Brandon Gordon and we have Nico Guerrera. Hey, Brandon. Hey, Nico. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, everyone.
But
Hey, thanks
before,
for having us.
Awesome. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items that we'd like to begin with. First, we'd love to keep this as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions for us, please use the Ask a Question tab below the presentation screen, and we'll do our best to answer all of your questions live today. And in addition, we know that you guys are here to hear from us. We would love to hear from you. So there's a Rate This tab also below the presentation screen. Leave us feedback. Let us know how we did, how we're doing, or what you'd like to hear at future events. Now, without further ado, I hand this off to today's speakers. Team?
Awesome, thanks. So like you said, this session today, we're talking about understanding your cloud costs and how you can save money. So in the beginning, I'm just going to do a quick little demo of some of the capabilities within Aria Operations. And then after I do the demo, I'll get into some slides and kind of explain um, how we how you can configure the cost, how you can get how the costs are calculated, kind of get into some of the details on how you can configure and make the cost reporting the most accurate for your environment that you can. So I know there's going to be a lot of explanation at the end. So even if you're curious about where all these numbers and things come from that I'll be showing, I will get into that and basically explain how we come up with all this stuff. So like I said, with that, let me just share my screen and do a quick demo. And then, like I said, I'll follow up with slides, explain how all this stuff is done. So to start off, I am here in Aria Operations. So since we're talking about cost today, I want to go into the cost option here. And you'll notice it gives me a bunch of different options here. So we have total cost of ownership, cost drivers, cost analysis, cost optimization, rate card, there's showback, chargeback, there's workload planning, infrastructure planning, and migration planning. So there's a lot of stuff in here that has to do with cost. So I'll go through a few of these. I won't go through all of them, but I'll go through a few and highlight some of the key stuff worth worth pointing out right now. So the first thing is total cost of ownership. So I'll go in here, and you'll notice we'll have all the different cloud types listed here across the top. So we have just vCenter, there's VCF, AWS, AVS, GCVE, etc. So you'll see all the clouds across the top. And then if you select one of the cloud types, you can see some of this cost breakdown. So since we're talking total cost of ownership here, this is high level numbers. So we're looking at here total cost of ownership based on my capacity. So we have how it is broken down based on the cost of my compute that I'm using versus what I have available. Um, and then we also have it on the storage side, what is used versus what's remaining. And then VM direct costs, those are costs that only apply to virtual machines. So they're not really infrastructure level costs, they're only VM level costs. By cost drivers here, so this is breaking down my cost by cost drivers so I can see how the various components go into the cost of my infrastructure. And you'll see here, looks like storage is the most expensive piece in this particular environment, but you can go through and kind of do that analysis. We can also see it here based on domains or clusters. Scrolling down, we see potential savings. So the potential savings are all the recommendations kind of aggregated showing here. So we have idle virtual machines. So these are VMs, that appear to be idle and they're not actually doing anything. So we can potentially, reclaim those to save some money. Orphan disks. So these are, VMDKs that are on a data store but not attached to a virtual machine. Oversized virtual machines. So this is, virtual machines that are, larger than they need to be. You can go and right size those virtual machines and save a little bit of money. Powered off virtual machines. So these are VMs that have been powered off. They're consuming storage, even though they're not running. They're using up storage, so we could free up that. Reclaimable hosts. So this is based on the capacity projections for the cluster. So it looks at what the cluster needs to run the workloads, and it projects that out into the future and says, this is how much capacity you need to run your workloads. And then it compares that to the size of the cluster and says, you can remove one host, two hosts, or et cetera. So it's that forward-looking projection, and then converting that into the number of hosts that you can take out and handle the projected workload into the future. And then the last one here is VM snapshots. So these are snapshots that have been around for a while that we can go and clean up. So it's pretty nice to see this pie chart, this breakdown. So we can see, if you hover over them, we can see our savings potential for each of those. And we also have here broken down by domain. And then down here on the bottom is realized savings. So this is when you take these recommendations and you actually perform actions against those. So let's say I have an idle virtual machine and I go and delete that virtual machine. Now that is realized savings. That's something we've actually taken an action and we've cleaned up something. So we actually quantify how much money we've saved by doing those actions. So you can see that down here. So by doing it's like this green was the oversized virtual machine. So we went through and fixed some oversized virtual machines that ended up saving us $236 for this month. So hopefully that makes sense. That's kind of the high level. Like we said, we're the TCO. So what I want to do now is go back and show you a couple of other things here. So cost drivers, this is where you can go and configure your cost settings. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the options when I get into the slides, because it's a little easier to have some visuals to kind of talk through some of these options. But the thing I wanted to highlight here is this is where you can go and basically enter your expenses, how much you paid for your servers, how much you pay for storage, license, applications, maintenance facilities, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff you can go in here. You don't have to go and configure all these. So if you don't configure them, it will use what we call reference costs. So these are like industry numbers that we have built into the system. So it gives us a default. But if you want to go and adjust these, you can make them more meaningful for your environment by going in and changing what you actually paid for the server you bought, when you bought it, and it'll help track the cost more effectively from that. So that's the main thing I wanted to show here. I'll talk more about in the slides in a minute. So going back up here, cost analysis. This is a relatively new feature. So this one allows me to go in and look at various cost or price or bill related metrics and do some additional analysis on that. So typically things that you would have to go and build a dashboard to do, this kind of helps you go through and create these cost related reports. So I'll just create a very simple one here just so you can see what we can get. Give it a name. So you see here, since we're doing cost, I have several metrics that I can pick from: total cost, realized savings, potential savings, month-to-date cost, and monthly projected total cost. I'll just pick total cost for now. And then I can go in here and pick my different group types. So let's say, look at the total cost for clusters, and let's go the last 12 months, and I will um, do this for the entire environment. So I can do vSphere World. So this will get all of the clusters throughout my entire environment, and then run. So you see now it's going and grabbing the top 10 clusters based on their total cost. And now I can see here what they've cost. And this has been basically over the past year, like I had asked for, and then tabular view down here. And then we can even go and export this to a file if I want. And I can save this. If I wanted to save up here, I can save and refer to this again in the future. So there's a lot of stuff you can go in here. I know I'm just barely touching the surface, but definitely encourage you to look at the cost analysis and create some reports that you can use to show cost. And like I said, you're basically, you don't have to do dashboards to create some of these reports anymore, which I think is really really nice, really helpful. So with that, let me switch back. Let me show. One of the main points for doing the cost, showing cost, is to actually show the cost of your virtual machine. So that's what we call showback. So showback is based on the cost of the virtual machine. So that's based on those expenses, like I was talking about. So you can go in here to this dashboard, and this dashboard automatically shows different groups. So this can be custom groups that you've created. This can be in VM folders. This can be clusters. This can be data centers. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at for a showback. But I'll just show you here. So this is looking at VMC World. So this is looking at my VMware Cloud on AWS environment. So I can see the projected cost of the virtual machines in my environment, potential savings. These are all the recommendations for the virtual machines running in the environment, and then my month-to-date cost. Over here, I can see the distribution of my virtual machines. Looks like I only have 2 listed here. Let me go to see if I have a better one. Um, some more interesting numbers. There we go. So we have a lot more virtual machines. So you can kind of see the distribution of these virtual machines, and you can see it's very easy to find, the most expensive virtual machine listed here. We also have potential savings over here, so we can find the virtual machines that have the most savings. And they're just, they're descending. So you can easily find the ones with the most savings if you want to go and target those to save as much money as you can. And then down here is basically a list of all of the virtual machines in the group. And you notice here, it'll also show deleted ones. If there are any deleted virtual machines, they'll show up here as well. And you can also go in here and export this. So if you wanted to export to a CSV, use this to send as a report to somebody, you can do that. There's also some out-of-the-box reports that you can run to do showback as well. So you can set them up and schedule them to automatically email. But if you want, you can create like custom groups, like I said, that can be things like your business units or application teams or things like that. So you can have those different constructs show up here on this dashboard automatically. So you can do any kind of cross reporting that you need to do. So with that, let me switch back up to the landing page. So Yeah, let me just show you a couple of the recommendations that you can see here. So I'm just going to the total cost of ownership page because it has a list of some showbacks. I mean, some dashboards. So I find this easy to go and find, various cost related dashboards that I'm looking for. So you can see here with like my depreciation, server hardware depreciation. So I can find servers that are depreciated. Um, my potential savings, reclaimable host. I'm going to reclamation here so you can see what that looks like. So these are all the reclamation recommendations. So that I was talking about, we have powered off virtual machines, idle virtual machines, VMware snapshots, and orphan disks. So it's just a matter of going in here, finding the virtual machine. So you can see here I can save $662 a month by reclaiming this powered up virtual machine. It's looked like it's using over 3 terabytes. Wow. Um, yeah, that's sorry, excuse me. So that's a pretty big opportunity to save some money there and some storage. So a couple things to point out here. We have a schedule action. So I can schedule this deletion to happen at a particular date and time if I wanted to. I can go and just delete it straight from here, or I can say exclude this virtual machine to stop recommending that I clean up this virtual machine. Same thing applies to my idle virtual machines, snapshots, orphan disks. So you can see the recommendation there and the cost savings. Um, and then one last thing I want to show here, and then I'll switch over and talk about how these numbers are calculated. So right sizing. So there is a cost component related to right sizing. It's a bit um, counterintuitive, but I do have a blog post that I wrote that goes really in depth in right sizing and covers the cost aspect of it as well. So I definitely encourage you can check that out. You can see how much how the right sizing cost recommendations are determined if you're interested in that. So basically, I just want to point out here on this VM right sizing details dashboard, you can see I've just selected vSphere World, so I'm looking at everything. And you can see here my recommendations for right sizing these virtual machines and then my potential cost. So this is a cost increase because these are undersized virtual machines. And then down here is cost increase because these are oversized virtual machines. So how much money I can either save or how much it will cost to fix the performance in some of these virtual machines. So this is the place you would want to go if you want to look at costs in the context of right sizing. This is the dashboard to go to. So um, with that, let me switch back now to the slides.
Brandon, we have one question. Is this being recorded? I think it is, right?
Uh, as far as I know, yes, it should be recorded.
Okay. We can wait for AJ to come back to get a full answer.
Yeah, I believe the plan is to post these to YouTube when they're done.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yep. So I think we're recorded. You should find them. Yeah, like Brendan said, we'll have these on YouTube when they're done.
Okay, so now what I want to do is kind of explain how you can configure the cost calculations to work, and then how some of these cost calculations actually are done. So the first thing is with cost calculation methods. So I'll need to define a couple of concepts first, and then I'll show you the choices that, and then explain how those choices impact cost. So the first one is talking about some of the definitions from a capacity perspective. So when you're looking at capacity, you have the total capacity of a cluster, which is the total resources for the entire cluster. And then if you take off HA, which is your settings that you have for admission control, that's how many hosts you can tolerate failures, or percentage, or however you have admission control configured. It takes that off, and then buffers. So these are buffers you can set in the policy. So that's additional reservation that you want to do for capacity. So once you take the total capacity and then you remove HA and buffers, you get what's called usable capacity after HA and buffer. So a very long name, but this is important when you're looking at it from a cost perspective, because this is basically the total usable and capacity that you have, that you can actually provision to virtual machines. So the HA and buffer piece is kind of like overhead, so that has to be accounted for in the cost of the virtual machines. So just remember the usable capacity after HA and buffer, and we'll see how that comes in here in a minute. The next thing is allocation model. So by default, cost is based on the utilization of the virtual machine. So how many gigahertz of CPU it uses, how many gigabytes of memory is consumed. So it's looking at the physical resources that are used by that virtual machine. But there is an option to enable what's called allocation model. So this is switching it to now looking at overcommit ratios. So let's say I want to do 4:1 CPU or core, or I want to do 1.1 gigabytes of memory per gigabyte of physical memory. So that's where I can say I want to over allocate my resources by these particular overcommit ratios. So this is a capacity setting, but once you enable allocation model for capacity, that automatically switches the cost calculations to use allocation model. So now, once you enable this, now cost will then be based on your overcommit ratios rather than utilization. So it's an important thing to understand when you're looking at cost. The ramifications of enabling allocation model for cost or for capacity will switch your cost over to allocation model. So. Um, so the way this basically works is we have the total cost of the cluster, and then we take that cost of the cluster and we figure out what the cost would be per um, for our what we call base rates. So this is the amount of money per, say, gigahertz of CPU per month, or the amount of money you want to for memory per gigabyte of memory, consumed memory per month. Or if you're doing allocation model, it would be the number of vCPUs, the cost per vCPU per month, or the cost per gigabyte of allocated memory per month. So that's basically you get your base rates from there. And then it uses those base rates to determine the VM cost. So let's talk about the three main options that we have here. Okay, so the first one is based on usable capacity after HA and buffer. So like I said, this is based on the utilization of the environment, not allocation. So this is utilization based. And you'll see here it's based on the base rates themselves are based on the usable capacity after HA and buffers. It's based on the total cost of the cluster, and then they can change. They would change infrequently because the total capacity or usable capacity of your cluster doesn't really change unless you're adding hosts, removing hosts, changing admission control, changing buffers. So there's very few things that would change the cost of the cluster and change the base rates. So this should be somewhat stable. The cost of the virtual machines are based on the VM's utilization. So this is how many gigahertz of CPU or how many gigabytes of consumed memory the virtual machine has. It takes that and multiplies it by the base rate of the cluster for CPU or memory. And then the other thing to point out here is the cost of the unused resources. So these are basically the stuff that's not used. The cost of those resources get assigned to a metric called unallocated cost. So basically, if you have the cost of your virtual machines plus the unallocated cost, that's where you get basically the total cost of your cluster. So and when you're running in this mode, you want to basically try to reduce your unallocated cost as much as possible, and that's through increasing your utilization as much as possible. So you want to use as much resources as possible, which reduces your unallocated costs, which improves the cost efficiency of the environment. Okay, so the second one here is actual utilization. So actual utilization is based on the cluster's utilization. So this is, you can have a cluster use only 100 megahertz of CPU. That's what it bases the cost on, is based on the actual utilization of the cluster itself. Sorry about that. And then it's based on the cluster's cost. And because the utilization of a cluster can change from day to day, the base rates can change quite a bit as well. So, there can be quite a bit of fluctuation from day to day when you're looking at those base rates. When you look at the VM's costs, again, the VM's cost is based on the VM's utilization times the base rate. So that again gets you the cost, but like I said, there'll be much more variability because the base rates also change based on the cluster itself. And the cost of the unused resources when you're in this mode get distributed to all the virtual machines within the cluster. So what that means basically is if I have a single virtual machine running on the cluster, it's basically going to cost the same as the cost of the cluster itself. If I have 1,000 virtual machines running on that cluster, then the cost of the unused resources gets distributed across all of those 1,000 virtual machines. So the question is, do you want that unallocated cost to go to, or the unused cost of the unused resources to go to the virtual machines, or do you want to track it separate? That's the main difference in actual utilization. So efficiency here is tracked based on your base rates. So you want to increase the cluster utilization, which decreases the base rates. So that's where you want to go there. And then the last one here is allocation model. And like I said, this is based on the overcommit ratios. This has nothing to do with utilization. This is purely looking at overcommit ratios. It's based on the cost of the cluster. And again, these will not change very often because you're not changing your base rates. The capacity of the cluster doesn't change unless you're adding hosts, removing hosts, and things like that. So there should be relatively stable. The cost of the virtual machine now is based on the VM's configuration. So it has two vCPUs times the base rate per vCPU to get the CPU rate. Same thing for memory. It's looking at the memory allocated to the virtual machine times the base rate for the memory for that virtual machine. So it's based on configuration now, not based on utilization. So again,
Brandon?
cost of unused resources. Yeah.
We have one question. We have a question. Does this allow you to limit your cloud costs? So if you reach a certain threshold, that things are powered off.
Not sure I understand the question. I mean, if you look at the reclamation, you can look at powered off virtual machines and you can power them off. But
I think they're asking if you hit a cost limit, can Aria Operations turn off the VMs so you don't hit that public cloud cost anymore?
well, this is not public cloud. This is running on vSphere.
Or
So
vSphere, yeah.
yeah, so I'm not sure it really applies, but
Okay.
there is Automation Central that you can use to automatically power off virtual machines. So if you wanted to, you could use that, or you can create an alert that if the cost of virtual machine goes above a certain threshold to power it off. So there's a couple of options you could do that, but that would only change the cost of the CPU and memory. You would still have storage cost when you even powered off virtual machines.
Thank you.
And then the last thing on here with the efficiency when your allocation model, you want to reduce that unallocated cost. So you want to basically have as many vCPUs and have as much memory as possible in the environment. So hopefully that makes sense. Those are your three main options. And where you configure the base rate calculation method is here. So when you go in the cost settings, the cluster cost tab, you can select your base rate calculation method. It defaults to usable capacity after HA and buffer. That's one I would recommend unless you have a specific use case that warrants actual utilization or allocation model. I would just go with the default. but you would know, how you like to do cost reporting, whether you need to do one of the other modes. So, okay. So now, let's talk about the cost of the cluster, how we get to the cost of the cluster itself. So there's basically 3 different ways we can do that. So I'll talk about each of those here. The first one is cost driver based. So this actually was the cost drivers that I kind of showed in the demo. So the first thing we talk about here is configuring depreciation. So this is something that the system will do automatically for you. So it'll take the cost of the server, what you paid for the server, and depreciates that over the time period that you configured. The default is for 5 years with a straight line depreciation model, but you can go and change that depending on how your company does depreciation. You want to make that match. So it it tracks the cost the monthly cost correctly based on your accounting requirements. Again, here's the cost drivers piece. So I talked a little bit about this in the demo. You want to go through and modify these to make them more accurate, but you don't have to. Like I said, we do have the cost reference database, which provides those default values. So if you don't want to go through and configure everything, you do have defaults. The number should be good enough. But if you customize the cost drivers, they'll be even better. So. Um, so I created this little diagram to kind of help visualize where the cost drivers go, what they influence. So you can see like storage goes into the data store cost and also comes from the host cost when you're talking about hyperconverged or vSAN hosts. Then you can see here all the server ones go into host system, and then there's a few here like the virtual machine, additional cost, virtual infrastructure operating system costs, guest OS costs, and application all go straight to the virtual machine. So those are direct costs. So um, I definitely encourage you to like a screenshot or come back to this diagram. It'll help you understand when you want to get into the math and understand why this particular cost or where it shows up. Some of them you know may not make sense initially until you actually look at it, like the server license cost. Um, you know, a server OS license actually gets applied to the host, which then gets distributed down to the virtual machine. I think it's probably the one that's the most it trips people up the most. But I'm trying to show that here on this diagram. So um, another thing here on the cost drivers, you have the ability to export and import those. So if you need to make a backup or you're transitioning to a new system or whatever reason, if you want to export them, you can bulk modify them, things like that. So you'll just select the ones you want, export, and then you can do the same thing here, import and import them back in. So can help you like when you're looking at the server purchases. You can go in and like bulk update the purchase date and purchase price and things like that. Okay, so the cost driver based cost. So like I said, we have the cluster cost, which drives the base rates, which drives the VM cost. So that's one I already talked about. Now, what we add in here is the cost drivers. So we use the cost drivers, we apply depreciation, and then that feeds into our cluster cost. So you see here, we're kind of completing the loop here, talked about how we configure the cost drivers, and then it applies that depreciation, and then it uses that to get the cluster costs, and then it goes through the whole process I talked about before, getting the base rates into the VM cost. Hopefully that makes sense, kind of completing the loop on the cost driver one. So with that, I'll switch over now and talk about bill-based costing. So there are a few VMware Cloud environments that do support bill-based costing. So it's VMware Cloud on AWS, VMware Cloud on Dell EMC, and the Google Cloud VMware Engine if it's through VMware resell. So if you bought it from VMware instead of from Google. So those 3 you can do bill-based costing. So when you go and you'll have basically a dashboard here that you'll be able to see the costs from your bills for your environment. You can track the cost over time, what you're actually spending over time for the different cloud. And when you are adding the cloud account, you'll see an advanced setting down here in the bottom that says billing enabled. You want to set that to true. Once you set that to true, it'll start collecting the bill, and that will then switch the system in telling it to do bill-based costing for that particular data center. or SCDC. So there's one thing specific here for VMware Cloud on AWS that's a little unique. It does have the ability to specify the infrastructure type, where you can go in and add some license costs and additional costs. So the VMC on AWS is the only one currently today that has this ability. So you can go there and add additional cost if necessary. So again, how does this work? You see over here on the right, we have the cluster cost, base rates, and VM cost. And then adding here on the left, basically we'll discover our SDDCs. So we look and see what we have available. We collect our bill, and then from that bill, we then can determine the cost of the cluster. So you see it now, again, instead of going through and configure cost drivers, now we have our SDDCs, we got our bill, that goes into our cost. And then we continue the same process that I already talked about. So hopefully that makes sense. It's just another way of getting that cluster cost instead of cost drivers. Now this is based on the bills. Okay, and the third option here is what we call rate card based costs. So this is supported on VMware Cloud and AWS, Azure VMware Solution, Google Cloud, VMware Engine, Oracle Cloud. I forget what that stands for. The Oracle Cloud one, and VMware Cloud on Dell EMC. So long list of stuff here. So the way this works is when you're in the cost drivers settings, there is a cloud providers tab, and you'll see all of the rate cards listed there. So those rate cards are used for the what if planning scenarios, which I just briefly mentioned when I was doing the demo. There's sections at the bottom of the cost where you can do different like migration planning scenarios. So these rate cards are used for those, but they're also used to determine the cost of those SCDCs. So if you want to go and modify them, you can download them, modify them, and re-upload them to make those costs more accurate based on what you're paying for the environment. And when you go into the cost settings, you'll see you have a lot of options up here to select your infrastructure type. Once you select your infrastructure type, you can go and adjust the ratios that's used to determine the cost. So you can see here, this one's showing a ratio of 5:1 to 0.5. That's CPU memory to storage. So it takes the cost of the SDDC, and then it breaks it up where 5 parts go to memory, 1 part go to 5 part go to CPU, 1 part to memory, and half a part goes to storage. Just a way of kind of divvying those up. You don't have to modify those, but if you need to tweak them for some reason, you can go in here and change them. So, but the defaults are usually good enough. Discount. So this is where if you have just a flat discount off your rate, you can go and enter the discount here, and instead of having to go and modify the rate card, it's a little simpler to just add a percentage, and then it'll just decrease the cost of the STDCs. And the last one there is the region. So if it's not able to determine the region for the data center, it will default to the region you specify there. So if it doesn't know what region the particular data center is, it'll, in this example, go to US East. So that kind of helps you identify which part of the rate card is used, especially for those, like I said, those that aren't identified. But a lot of these actually know what region they're in, so they'll be flagged correctly, and then they'll pick up the right cost from the right region from the rate card. But this is only a failback if you added vCenter, but didn't add it through the native integration. So if you kind of bypass that, that's a way of getting it to make these changes. So. Again, how do we calculate the cluster cost? So you see here, we discover the SDDCs. We look up the cost from the rate card. And then once we have the cost from the rate card, that is then used to determine the cost of the cluster itself. So hopefully that makes sense now. We've seen the 3 different ways: cost drivers, bill, and now rate card. So 3 different ways of doing it, depending on what you've got in your environment, what you're looking to do. Okay, so I didn't talk too much on pricing, but just want to basically illustrate the differences between when we're talking about cost and we talk about price. So they are distinct topics, and they're treated separately within Aria Operations. So it's good to understand the difference between those two. So far, I've only really been talking about cost. So that's how much you actually pay for the resources. So let's just kind of define some of the terms here so we can understand the difference when I talk about cost and price and showback and chargeback. What we mean by these terms. So cost and showback, you use that to quantify how much it costs to run the virtual machines. So that's how much you paid for the server that's running the virtual machine, and you distribute the cost of that server to the virtual machine. So that is basically looking at your expenses and distribute that to the cost of the virtual machine itself. So like I said, that's cost is the amount of money you spend to run the virtual machine. Um, and showback is basically creating a report based on based on the cost to show how much it costs you to run the virtual machines for the customer. So showback doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna give the customer a bill. It's more just trying to influence behavior, trying to say this is how much it's costing the company to run the this virtual machine. You know, you know, try to be a good a good consumer of our resources and minimize your costs as much as possible. It's not really an enforcement or anything. It's just kind of educational. So that's kind of the way it's treated. Um, you can is more like I said, showback, just education and influence behavior. So now when you're talking price and chargeback, so price, that's really when you want to create a bill and you want to start charging your end users for running their virtual machines. So this is if you have a chargeback mechanism, if you have any kind of internal accounting or cost transfer, things like that. This is where the price and chargeback comes into play. So price is how much you want to charge the customer, either based on cost or allocation. The price can be based on cost, or you can base it on the allocation or what you've allocated to the virtual machines. You have options of adding like upcharges. You want to make a profit. There's additional fees and stuff you want to add. You can start adding all those things in on the price. So like I said, you can base the price on the cost and then add other stuff if you wanted to, like, um, and then chargeback. Chargeback is actually creating a bill. So this is basically showing the end user how much you're going to charge them to run their virtual machine. So hopefully that makes sense. That kind of illustrates the difference between the two. Cost and showback is based on expenses and kind of education. Price and chargeback is based on actually doing a chargeback. Charging the user for the virtual machine. Whether it's for profit or just recouping your expenses, is up to your business model. But hopefully that makes sense. So there is separate dashboards like the showback dashboard that I showed at the beginning. There is a chargeback dashboard. So once you configure your pricing cards, it'll start calculating the price of the virtual machines as well as the cost. And then you'll be able to use the chargeback dashboard to show the prices of those virtual machines, and you can use that to generate reports to send to your users. So hopefully that makes sense. The difference between the two. Um, so when you're configuring pricing, there's what we call pricing cards, and there's a few different places where you can go and configure pricing. So there's natively within Aria Automation. So Aria Automation, you can create a pricing card, and you can define basically how you want to determine the price. You have options to base price on either cost or rate. Rate is like allocation. The OS that's installed in there, any tags that are on the virtual machines, you can make them one-time charge, or you can make it recurring. So there's a lot of options that you can go through. I think some of the popular examples that I'd like to give is like if a virtual machine is backed up, you want to charge, say, 2 times the amount of disk space that is used by the virtual machine. So you can take the storage price, multiply by 2 if it has a backup tag, or if the virtual machine has a tag that it's protected for DR. Maybe I want to charge 3 times the total cost of the virtual machine. So I can add in, if it has this tag, charge 3x the total cost of the virtual machine. So you can do things like that in price where you can't do that in cost. Um, And then here, this is just kind of showing the integration between Aria Automation and Aria Operations. So you can see we have a dashboard that shows the deployment price. You can also see the price within Aria Automation. So when you're in Aria Automation, you only see price, you don't see cost. So if you are using Aria Automation, you will have to configure pricing cards, and then you can configure the pricing cards to be based on cost. So it essentially would be the same thing, but just so you're aware. And then there's a dashboard that I created called VM cost versus price. This is a way of basically allowing you to determine if what you're charging for the virtual machine allows you to either recoup your expenses or has enough profit for for your business. So it kind of gives you that comparison. You don't want price to be less than cost. Pretty much any other scenario is fine, but price being less than cost, could be a problem. So. One thing I did not mention with the pricing cards, I forgot. So I did talk about Aria Automation. You can also configure the pricing cards natively within Aria Operations. So those would be for VMs that are not managed by Aria Automation. So there is that option there as well. So that's all the slides I had for today. I know it was a lot to go through really fast, but hopefully that makes sense. You can get a good understanding of kind of where these costs are coming from and how we calculate them, and then some of the settings that you can go and configure. Just want to open up. Are there any questions? Happy to answer any questions. I think we've got a couple that already came up that we answered. But if there are any more questions, feel free to ask.
Excellent. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Mika. We'll stay on for a few more minutes just to give time for folks to ask us questions. But again, like you mentioned before, this is being recorded, and we can share this out post-event. So if you did register for this event, you will receive the on-demand recording. If you haven't registered, if you'd like to share this with anybody else, the link that you accessed to register for this event will also turn into an on-demand registration page. I do have a question for you both. If anyone had any questions, what would be the best way to reach out to you guys? Is LinkedIn a good way to do so?
Yeah, LinkedIn would be good.
Excellent. All right. Let's see here. And since we are in event season, another question for you guys: VMware Explore is around the corner. Will you guys be giving out any sessions at that event, or will you guys be in Las Vegas for Explore?
Yeah, I've got several sessions that I'll be doing. I don't know, the number keeps changing, but I have several sessions, and I know so I will be there. You should be able to find me around somewhere.
Yeah, I'll be at the I'll be at one of our booths. We have a operations management booth where we'll be kind of taking questions on our Aria operations management stack, which includes Aria operations for logs, and so if you have any questions about either of those, or you want to get some information on how to use it better or anything like that, just stop by the Aria Ops booth, and me and one of my colleagues will be there to answer your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Nico. That'd be my segue. So if you don't want to ask a question here through the chat, feel free to meet the gentleman in Las Vegas, in sunny Las Vegas, in about a month, and you can ask them there live. It does look like those are all the questions that we had today. So I do want to just give a special thank you to Brandon and to Nico for today's presentation, for the live demo, and then for you guys for the questions that you guys have submitted. If you have any questions, you can continue to ask them through this platform, and we can respond via email. Or if you'd like to reach out directly to Brandon and Nico, you can do so on LinkedIn or in Las Vegas at Explore next month. I think August 22nd to the 24th in Las Vegas at VMware Explorer. So once again,
21st.
Thank you, Brandon. 21st, sorry, 21st
no
and 24th. There we go. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Nico. We hope to see you guys at our next event. Have a great day, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Cheers.